So thank you to everybody. And let's get settled in. I hope you have your coffee. Yes. All right. And I'm going to hand this over to get us started with Dory C. Scott, CEO of Wise Women, poet, speaker, storyteller, scholar, and it also author. And you also are a social worker, which was fun to find out with Monica today.
Yes, I am. Yes, I
And
am.
what else did you discover in the room with Monica that was a lot of fun today?
Oh my goodness. So I take pride in the way in which I speak. And I often tell people I'm from another place in this part of the world. And she said, "Oh, you're from New Jersey." We're both from New Jersey. And I think in some things that I say, it just slips right in. I still say coffee.
Coffee. That's so funny. I just love when people sort of just do that connection. It was so much fun watching you and Monica. You're like, now we know two Jersey girls in the room. Everybody watch out. When we talk about empowerment, changing the world, and talking about diversity and culture, well, you're in the right room. I'm going to hand it over to you, Dory. Thank you so much. And everybody get ready for a great program.
Thank you so much. And I want to tell you before Monica comes on, Jersey girls get it done. We came here, we work here, we love being here, we get it done. Typically, you hear me talking about, can I get a witness? Come on with me this morning. Can I get a witness? One more time. Can I get a witness? I've been asked to put that out. So we are going to publish that for you. They're putting a lot of pressure on a sister girl. I promise it's coming. But today I want to tell you this. I'm an old lady now. That's what she said to me. Born in 1930, April 14, I turned 91 years old. Some women received the right to vote when I turned 10. Yes, when I turned 10. The 19th Amendment, 1920. And the 10 more years I lived in the segregated South, Jim Crow South, descendant of an enslaved people, I decided to leave. You see, I'm from Georgia, a peach, pretty as a peach, she said, a proud Georgian. Yet I had to leave there because I knew there was something better for me. So with the history, I wondered, can I get a witness in a different place? Can I create something new in a different place? Voter suppression? I thought I left it there. Women's rights? I thought it was going to be better in the North. White supremacy? I thought it was going to be different in the North. And Black male incarceration? I thought it would be better in the North. Now we call it a new Jim Crow. But ladies, don't stop, she told me. Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop. Can I get a witness? Can I get a witness? Tell your story, live your purpose. I'm an old lady now, and you must carry on. Can I get a witness that you will carry on? Slower than I used to be, my mind is still strong. So when you see me, just take a breath and be reminded of the weary, of those who struggled, of those who died, of those who have been less forgotten, who fought, who sought, who spoke out for every woman, all God's children, who came to make a difference. Though I left and went north, I'm still fighting. Can I get a witness? You see, the struggle is real. The vote out we must get, we must hope for, we must believe for, we must get it. We must continue to turn all those places blue. You are the reason that I am here for this season. Can I get a witness? Can I get a witness? My mother is 91. This is the story of my mother. And I spoke with her on my birthday, June 1st, and I said, tell me what it was like. And she said to me, I'm an old lady now, but I still have the fight. We must continue on. Can I get a witness? All that to say, I'd like to introduce our special guest. We already know that she's from New Jersey, so we know she's a mighty woman. We know that women from New Jersey get things done. She was born in New Jersey, but she doesn't live in New Jersey and went to school in Arizona. She got her master's in clinical social work from Arizona State University. She is a licensed clinical social worker and has been working with children and families for 20 years. She loves being a social worker. She works in organizations in North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and our good old Virginia. Monica is also a certified trauma and resilience professional. Ms. Belton is an advocate, an activist, and yes, she can get a witness. She fights for equity, social justice, mental health, and wants people to become more aware of what mental health is. It's not a disease that we cannot ignore any longer. She serves as a board member of PBS NewsHour Extra and has been featured on topics involving mental health, suicide prevention, and addressing race in schools. She's a certified in several evidence-based intervention programs and practices expertise in social emotional learning, substance abuse prevention, restorative practices, positive behavior intervention, and supports everything that is right to make all blue. Monica has developed several programs for groups and individuals. She's also the founder of her own not-for-profit. I mean, this woman is a badass girl. Come on now, can we get a witness? She's a badass. Can I get a witness? Okay? She continues in her current research to make the world better. She's going to make you better right now. You got to witness. You got to listen. But all she wants you to do is be the witness. Can I turn it over to you, Monica?
Wow. I'm glad I had the recording of that because my parents would be like, who do you think you are? Thank you so much for that. That was actually really beautiful. And of course, the spoken word was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. So yes, I am here today to talk about having conversations about race and humanity. And it would be easy if this was an easy topic. But the reality is that talking about race is difficult. It's ugly. And for a lot of people, it can cause harm when you do not understand it. So our goal for today is to highlight information that I believe is pertinent to understanding work, everyone's work in this fight for anti-racism. So I'm going to share my screen because I always like to, in the very beginning of pretty much all of my talks, do a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is simply an understanding and a moment to take aside and say that we are all living on stolen land. I believe that most of us today are all in Northern Virginia, and this is a traditional Native American territory of the Manahoic Native Americans. If you are not in Virginia and you want to find out the Native American territory on which you reside, there's a website that I put up there on the screen. You can actually text your city and state where you are, or even if you want to know someplace else about where you're from, the city and state that is currently known as, and it will send you back the Native American nation or nations that resided on that land. So if you are interested in doing that, I would encourage you. It's totally free. But then also, it's a really cool way to connect and educate people around you about the land that you live on and that many of us benefit from. And so I always like to pause and do that and do a land acknowledgement because unless you are Indigenous to this land, we are all living on stolen land. I also like to start off with these two quotes. James Baldwin, who many of you may know, an author and activist, said this: "It comes as a great shock that the flag that you pledge allegiance to has not pledged allegiance to you." And I really believe that for a lot of people, this quote rings true to the past 18 months of our lives. I think for a lot of people, a veil has been dropped and a realization of the land that we are living on and the society that we are living in has really been an eye-opening experience for a lot of people. since the murder of George Floyd specifically, when the entire world could no longer deny police brutality. And many people really wanted to start to understand the plight of people of color, Black and Indigenous people specifically, in lands that have been colonized. And so I like to start off with this quote because I want people to understand where I'm coming from when I'm doing workshops and presentations, because this is not a fight against white people. It is a fight against hate and a fight against oppression. And when we come into any types of talks about race and racism and equity with that clear understanding that if we are on the side of love, we are all on the same side. And that is where we need to start. Lena Watson, who is an Indigenous Australian activist, and many people are not aware, and I can't blame you if you aren't, that Australia has a very similar colonization history as the US. And what she says is, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you recognize that your liberation and mine are bound up together, we can walk together. We're going to talk a little bit in this workshop about America and what it was meant to be, what it was before colonization, very briefly. But the reality is, again, that we are all in this together. Being American is a nationalization. You either are born here or you became a citizen of America. It is not a race. It is not a ethnicity. It is a definition. And if you've ever left the country, you would know what people think about Americans as a whole culture, right? So it's really hard to deny, even if you live here, that we are all not sharing the same society, the same experience, and how important it is that we do that together. In all of my work, I truly believe for the past 230,000 years, 350,000 years, that Homo sapiens have been walking around this world, right? And only around 8,000 BC did we discover the beauty of agriculture, right? And then living in cities and civilizations. We have just begun. And I really believe that this is the story of evolution. And so I ask everyone to have an open mind and open heart as we begin to evolve in this conversation. So I've done this particular video. I made this video in the beginning of COVID because we can no longer visit the burial ground for the formerly enslaved. And so it's interesting to me because I usually get to show this video to people all around the world. And now I get to share it with people from Nova. So I'm really, really happy about that. I want to make sure, I'm actually going to stop share and share again, just to make sure I hit the sound because I'm really good at not doing that. And as it's a quick video, but I really, really hope that people maybe jot down some questions or comments that you maybe had information that you had never known before about this particular spot.
Hi everybody. So even though we couldn't physically be together today, I wanted to start off our time together in this place. This is the burial ground for the formerly enslaved in Ashburn, Virginia. So this burial ground is located on the southeast corner of Route 7 and Belmont Road. This location was a site of a plantation owned by Thomas Ludwell Lee, the son of Thomas Lightfoot Lee, who actually has his signature on the Declaration of Independence. So unlike this plantation, Loudoun County actually had an amount of land that was actually owned by Black people after the people who were enslaved and then freed were able to own property, probably sometime after the 1865 creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. Between that time and now, Black people left those lands to head to the cities for employment or because of the lack of resources to farm their land. Many Black people were also evicted from their land when tax rates became unsustainable or the areas were sold for construction. Some of the images in the rest of this video may be disturbing to see, but they were a lot more disturbing to experience. I did not create any of the images here other than the video recordings that I'm featured in. So the reason that this area is here and we're able to come and visit it is because of a foundation called Loudoun County Freedom Center and its founder, Pastor Michelle Thomas. So according to her, when they were making plans to widen Route 7 and expand the road here by Belmont, the bodies of the formerly enslaved that were buried here, their skeletal remains were literally being tossed into the adjacent pond to this land right here. And I'm going to take you guys and show you around a little bit. But it's important to note that people were totally disregarding our history, our cultures, our bodies of our ancestors. In this area on the property is the actual pond where there are thought to be remains of many people who were enslaved, as well as lots of other artifacts. The Loudoun Freedom Center really hopes to have an archaeological dig here so that we can reveal even more about the lives of the people who lived on this land. As we move down the trail, we can see what is rebuilt as a replica of the schoolhouse that originally started off as some foundation that they found in this area and assumed it to be the place where they would secretly educate the children. All throughout the grounds, you will find rocks that look just like this, and Pastor Michelle will tell you that these rocks were dug from the ground and are used in the hand quarries where enslaved people would collect rocks that would be transported up to the main house for building or construction of homes, other buildings, fire hearths, and other things that required stone. The Loudoun Freedom Center uses this time to talk about how it must have been that day in 1865, about 3 generations ago, where over 500,000 Virginians were enslaved. They take us back to a moment where people who were enslaved must have been sitting on this ground, working the rock quarry and talking to each other under the shade of these trees, and they received news that they were to be freed. Now, it took almost 5 years for every person who was enslaved to be released because the proclamation was only being enforced by the Union Army, not locally. Some enslaved people actually escaped to Union bases and were protected by the armies there. The Union Army was fighting to defend the Declaration of Independence that was written nearly 100 years prior. One of the lesser-known documents of that time was the Virginia Declaration of Rights that was written by George Mason on June 12, 1776. When I read this, I think of what is happening right now in our lives, in this country, and just what a melody this whole experience of life is for human beings. So I want to read a segment from Section 3. That government is, or ought to be, instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community. Of all various modes and forms of government, that is best which is capable of producing the greatest degree of happiness and safety, and is most effectually secured against the danger of maladministration. And that, when any government shall be found inadequate or contrary to this purpose, a majority of the community has an indubitable, inalienable, and indefeasible right to reform, alter, or abolish it, in such a manner as shall be judged most conducive to the public weal. Now, if you ever have a chance to take the tour of the Loudoun Freedom Center and the burial ground for the formerly enslaved with Pastor Michelle, and you have extended amount of time, she actually takes you over to the Potomac River at the very far end of the plantation, what used to be the plantation. And you actually stand with her on the river bank and reflect on the fact that these enslaved people were literally so close to freedom. It was on the other side of the river in Maryland. But they were so enslaved, not just in their bodies, but in their minds, that they could not and would not escape. Will hear me talk about time in terms of generations. I'm generalizing a lifetime about 70 years, so you can give or take a generation from that. When we say things like the 1980s, our minds tell us how long ago that was, when many of us were alive and thriving then. So when we talk about time and we list years, sometimes there is a different determination of how long ago that was. For instance, in 1619, that was about 6 generations ago. And I find this to be a relevant comparison because many white people know where in the world their family was at that time, that many generations ago. But people of African descent do not. An estimated 12 million people were enslaved from Africa and made the voyage from Africa to the Americas. 2 million of those people died en route, either by disease, dehydration, torture, or from suicide. Ship captains had to place netting around the ships to catch people who were enslaved from jumping off into the oceans to escape. What else is less known about this time were the white crew members who also committed suicide or ran away to avoid participating in this cruelty. Once in the Americas, these working-class white allies aligned with people who were enslaved to rebel against slavery. One of the key battles in this fight was the Bacon's Rebellion. It was after that battle that wealthy and middle-class white people granted legal protections and privileges for all people of European descent, regardless of their economic status. They did this to limit the amount of people who were rising up to fight against them. Around 1740, so about 4 generations ago, the Negro Act of 1740 was passed that prohibited people who were enslaved from gathering and educating each other. One of the other reasons why this area specifically is so important is because this was given to the enslaved people as an area where they were allowed to be because the soil was not very fertile and it wasn't good for planting crops. And so while they were down here using the ground pretty much just to break up the rocks and with their hands in a hand quarry like I showed you earlier, it was also a place where they were allowed to have church. And as we know, historically, Black people used church as a time to gather, plan, and educate each other. That's why we know that that building that I showed you earlier is more than likely was the schoolhouse and the church and the meeting grounds for people to learn and to talk and to plan. When I come to places like this one, where there's a clearing into the woods and between the trees, it makes me think about what could have been happening here. A whole generation of enslaved people that are forming a new culture, forming a new way of thinking, forming a new language, forming new ways to eat and to sleep and to survive. This is the Freedom Trail, which is the name that the Loudoun County Freedom Center gave to the main loop that takes you around the burial ground. So what you see here are the field stones that mark the graves where people are buried. This and another more prominent stone are located here, amongst these other stones that are pretty much implanted into the ground with the pointed edge towards the sky. It's sad to think that at this time it was probably considered a privilege to be able to bury your loved ones or the other enslaved people in your plantation. This area is what the Loudoun Freedom Center designated as Preacher's Rock, and they consider this to be the place where the leader or the person giving the sermon to the enslaved people stood and spoke on Sundays when they were allowed to gather. So here, as we are leaving the burial ground for the formerly enslaved at Belmont, it is palpable the amount of strength, resiliency, bravery, courage that it took to survive this time in history.
So other than the award-winning camera work that you witnessed, I really hope that people were able to, if you have never visited or never got the full tour of the burial ground for the formerly enslaved, it is beyond powerful. So I've had the fortune of having the full tour. And I know that Ron Campbell, who is one of the co-founders of Loudon Freedom Center, does frequently give tours there. But it's so interesting when we're having these conversations and beginning these conversations, or even these basic understandings of race, racism, and equity, about how little we know and how angry or frustrated people become with themselves because they don't know. But we were literally designed. The system was designed for us not to know. So do not feel frustrated or angry with yourself, but continue to grow. So I like to start back at the very beginning. So I mentioned earlier about the 350,000 years that Homo sapiens have been walking around this earth. The word race, razas, was a word that was denoted in Spain in the beginning of the Spanish Inquisition. So if anyone ever wants to understand, like, how did we even get here? This is where. Yes, there were other systems throughout the world, throughout history, that put people in different castes or in different levels of society. But race was the first time that almost permitted people to look at someone's physical characteristics and determine their worth or their value. So from 1478 till present day, which is really historically not a long period of time, people have been trying to justify through science and anthropological means, all these other things, to say that there is such a thing of race, that there is a biological difference between people. Prior to that, ancient knowledge really just tells us that people looked different and their culture was different, their practices were different based on where they were physically at on the earth, their geographical adaptations. Now, since at least 1978, but of course prior to that, people have been trying to help people understand that race is not a real thing. Race is something that is made up. I point this out, and I'm actually going to point out several other documents that have been worldwide, distributed worldwide through organizations as the UN, the American Anthropological Association, United Nations, again, National Institute of Health, National Geographic. This original published work by 1978 was based on over 7,000 research studies, anthropological studies of human beings that found there was no such thing as race. Then in 2010, which is where this excerpt is from, the United Nations General Assembly says, now we have DNA evidence to say that people are not biologically different from each other. There is no biological difference that separates someone other than the amount of melanin in their skin. And when you really start to expand your world and realize that there are people of different shades and colors with different sized noses and heights and whatever, and all these anomalies of people that you never knew existed or don't fit the mold, then you really start to understand that race is strictly something that is made up. So I'm going to leave this up here for a second just to get people to a chance to absorb this excerpt. Again, talking about the fact that race is not real, and not only is it not real, but it's harmful. And so this document that was distributed in 2010 was signed by over 78 different countries to say that it is wrong. Further studies, again, scientific evidence, concluding this map put together by George Chaplin to talk about melanin, right? If we want our kids or ourselves to understand anything, it is about melanin and skin. That is what gives brown people brown color. And he was able to correlate the amount of melanin in someone's skin with the amount of UV radiation on the earth. Like, it's literally just that simply scientific. But yet, here we are in a world full of race and racism. And again, laying core foundations, the basic understanding of race. When we ask people, what is race? What is race even? Many people, even now, don't have this basic understanding. They know that the conversations that it starts, they know the damage that can even be caused and how some people are hurt by it. But trying to really understand what race is, to define it as an idea, not a structure. It is an idea, not a foundation. It's just this idea that human species is divided into distinct groups on the basis of inherited physical and behavioral differences. And even though race is not real, racism, of course, very much is. Racism being this normal practice of operating that benefits elite and working class white people by racializing groups, by trying to tell someone that the color of someone's skin tells you about who they are, their ethics, their values, their character. You would know all that just by looking at the amount of melanin in someone's skin. That is what racism does. And people are often surprised by this definition, saying that I thought it was benefited everyone that was white. And that is absolutely never have been the purpose of racism. And we'll get more into that. And racism is a tool. It is a tool of white supremacy. And I put the definition up here again, because it's one of those terms that gets said and people think that they understand. But to really understand white supremacy, understanding that someone's core belief is that a person who is white is inherently superior. So remember, race and racism teach us that, right? White supremacy being the overarching umbrella, are inherently superior to other races, and that white people should have control over people or other races, right? Neely Fuller was a profound author, and what he said is, if you do not understand white supremacy and racism, what it is and how it works, everything that you will understand will only confuse you. And we're going to talk about how pervasive racism is and how we may not even understand what we think that we do. This is a wheel that was developed by an organization in Canada, and it's called the Wheel of Power and Privilege. When we talk about white supremacy, why it even exists, it is a system of beliefs that the attempts to secure power and privilege. So what you see in this wheel is the center being the people who have the most power and privilege. And then radiating out from that in categories of gender, skin color, citizenship, religious practices, language, money, abilities, body weight. We see less and less power and privilege. And by no means is white supremacy an American issue. It is a worldwide issue. And again, if you've ever been outside of this country, even in countries that are not predominantly white, you would probably see that white, cisgender males, neurotypical, heterosexual, slim-bodied, able-bodied, relatively wealthy, speaking English, and are Christian, would have more power and privilege than even the citizens of that country. And when you look at this power and privilege wheel, you would see, again, if you were someone who was non-denominational, maybe average build, even had some neurodivergence. But if you were white and not darker toned or Black, you would still have more privilege. This is probably the most honest representation of power and privilege that I have seen depicted. And I think it really helps people to understand when we're talking about power and privilege, we're talking about money, land ownership, greed, these type of things, right? The ability to control economies, rules, and how race and racism were things that were invented to secure this circle. So there have been countless research studies now on the negative effects of racism. I, of course, concentrate a lot on the social aspects of it, right? So physical health, mental health, socialization problems, work productivity problems, issues of parenting. So now we're talking about future generations, global and societal problems associated with race and racism. When we talk about it being an invention to secure the power and privilege of wealthy and middle-class white people, right? Are people who are above or can secure their place above these problems, right? And so that's exactly what we're talking about. If you are lower income or even a poor white person and really understanding how race and racism works, you would understand that that there is no benefit. So that's easy, right? An easy problem to solve. We can just stop being racist. Just stop it. Just stop hating people based on the color of their skin. And we can all just get along and be happy, and we all just are nice to each other. But unfortunately, that is not the answer, because it has so much more than just being kind to other people. This education and understanding of real history is the foundation to fighting white supremacy, the foundation to fighting racism, is the understanding that we were very much okay, and when I say we, I'm talking about America, at some point we were very much okay with bad things happening to other people as long as it benefited us. The good news is, and if I don't know if anybody else knew this before watching the video, that even back in 1619, there were white people who were saying, this is not okay. We're not going to just stand by and watch this happen. And at that point, the power and privilege, of course, we're talking about 1619 in America, where there was very little laws governing anything. And we'll talk about one of those laws in a minute. But since then, and to today, there are people who are fighting against this. I put together another quick video. This is the last one. It's only about 5 minutes long. I do want to put in the caveat that there is some powerful imagery in here that could be disturbing to some people. But if you have watched the news at all in the past 18 months, you have seen all of this before. But the point of exhibiting this is to talk about where we have come and where we are going, and that we are not alone in these endeavors by any means.
That's bogus right now, bro. You know it's bogus. You can't even look at me like a man because you a bum, bro.
Mama, I love you. Reese, I love you.
I think we need to change stuff right now to make a better world later on.
16-year-old Whitaker Swan felt compelled.
Saw what happened to George Floyd and said, I have to do something.
He told his dad, Chris, he wanted to organize a protest in Sandy Spring.
I have absolute right to document. You don't have to take I'm not taking your picture. This is Facebook Live.
Here's what we're gonna do. That's fine.
I need to go back to the 12th floor to finish writing my paper.
What's you got your ID on you?
Yeah, I do.
All right, can we see that?
Why?
We got a police call for you.
And we need to make sure that you belong here.
Okay, let me open my apartment for you so that you can see that I belong here.
Some people have the belief that people with black or brown skin should not have the same rights or privileges as people with white skin. This is called racism.
And I'm taking a picture and calling the cops. Please call the cops. Please call the cops. I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life. Please tell them whatever you like.
Your everyday life, you're getting treated differently and sometimes with more respect, or people just trust you more, or they have certain expectations of you, like you might be smarter or you might be wealthier because you're white.
If I was ever like the mayor or something that controls the policemen, I would want to go out and look in the neighborhoods where there are people that's very friendly so you can pick them instead of like these guys that's just doing all this training. It's better to pick people that's more minded with the community than to just pick some new guy and get on the street. Like, it's just not gonna work out.
How did you feel when you were out there?
It felt good that everyone cared about what was happening.
Do you think sometimes people underestimate kids?
Yes, but we can do anything.
Young people who know their voices and their actions can make a difference.
4th and Sawyer on March 29th. After running past an unidentified person, the officer chases after another person who turns out to be 13-year-old Adam Toledo.
Stop! Anti-racism is the goal, but the goal is not the language or the words. The goal is the feeling. Yep. When the words get adopted into the discourse of power and gets articulated by a person whose work is about oppression, it means that they have taken the word, colonized it, and trying to sell you back something that you feel in your soul. So we've got to be able to call that out.
Around 2 p.m. local time Sunday, police pulled over Wright. The police chief says they stopped Dante Wright because he had an expired registration on his license plate.
My sign says, color is not a crime. It means that black people and brown people not get hurt by the police.
A botched raid. An officer down. A 26-year-old woman shot dead by police.
Is the alert able to talk to you? No, please.
Her name, Breonna Taylor.
People out here don't even like to call the police anymore. Say, for what? Even if the police come, even if somebody gets arrested, nothing's going to happen. People are tired. People are angry. The volume's been turned all the way up. And what happens when you turn the volume all the way up? When you get feedback? And we're going to give them some feedback.
Stop. 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 I have a right to stop you because you're being suspicious.
Well, okay.
Turn around.
No,
Turn around.
Actually, your hands are
Turn around. Stop. Stop tensing up, dude. Stop tensing up.
Not everybody that says anti-racist is about anti-racist work. Not everybody that says cultural relevance is on your team. And so you have to ask people, what do you mean by that?
I want every white person in this room who would be happy to be treated as this society in general treats our citizens, our black citizens. If you, as a white person, would be happy to receive the same treatment that our black citizens do in this society, please stand. You didn't understand the directions. If you white folks want to be treated the way blacks are in this society, stand. Nobody's standing here. That says very plainly that you know what's happening. You know you don't want it for you. I want to know why you're so willing to accept it or to allow it to happen for others.
Jane Elliott, love her. I think when I was at Arizona State studying social work, she was one of the those people that really sang to me and said, this is something I want to do. And that question, I think, posed the way that it's posed really gets people to think about how white supremacy works and how our roles fit into this world that we're living in. On January 6th, I know that a lot of people had different emotions when they were watching the turmoil unfold in our capital. And a lot of thoughts and reasonings came across people's minds. But you know what I thought to myself, and people were specifically calling the insurrectionists, they were calling them nationalists. And sometimes it doesn't sound like such a bad word. But then it reminded me of this proclamation. This proclamation was given by King George from Britain in 1763. Now, many of us know about the Boston Tea Party or even the Boston Massacre initiating the American Revolution. What a lot of people are not aware of was that back in 1763, another main reason for the American Revolution. So now we're looking at these people who are national, we're calling nationalists, saying they are very American and they don't represent, saying that they don't represent America. I think now that we have come to terms that they absolutely did. King George said to the people of the 13 colonies, you need to stop taking land from Native Americans. There has been too much bloodshed, and you are now entitled to only the land east of the Appalachian Mountains. And so the people that were already here, these Americans, didn't like that. So yes, we didn't like taxation without representation, but we also didn't like the fact that people were telling them to stop killing and stop colonizing and stop pillaging and burning down villages. And so when they wanted something, they went and took it. And that is the dark part of what is very American. Now, I don't want to, I'm very aware, and I always remind my kids of the privileges that we have living in this country, and that this country has the potential to be something beautiful and something great. It really, really does. But let's never forget, again, just like the land acknowledgement, let's never forget how we all got here. And where are we now? I always like to sit back, not always like to sit back and think, but it's important to sit back and think about how a country that from coast to coast was 100% brown people. And these are the census estimates from 2019, right? Where we're talking about really 78.5% of people identifying as white. So when you think about, again, this journey is about understanding real history and understand how a country went from 100% brown to 78.5% white. 13.6% people who identified as African American or Black. That Native American population of indigenous people, again, 527 years ago, is now 1%. And we have, of course, our Asian population, our Asian brothers and sisters at 5.9%. People who identify two or more races, 2.8%. People who identify as Hispanic or Latino, 18.5%. I put this little scale at the bottom because, of course, this is census estimates from 2019. However, up until 1950, the census worker was the one who would determine your race. You weren't allowed to mark down whether or not you were white only, white but Hispanic, Native American. The census worker would be the one to tell you that. And they were trained using this Lucian scale. So up into a certain number, and I have looked everywhere and I can't find this number. I don't know which number stops being white. But of course, you can make your own determination for that. But this was a real scale that they used. So, we hear about what happened over in Germany during the Holocaust, and we know that there was these other scales determined to determine whether or not someone was of a pure race. They were doing the same thing here. We just didn't know about it. So I talked a little bit earlier, and this is, I think, a really pertinent part of this conversation. Because again, we know that there's some history. We understand that white supremacy is not fighting white supremacy is not a fight against white people. It's a fight against a system of hate to secure someone else's power and privilege, unless you are really wealthy. If not, consider being a sponsor to Women's Summit. But really understanding the pervasiveness of racism. There's a book called Healing from Racial Trauma, written by Ruth Wise, and I have all the references at the end of this PowerPoint. But she very clearly identifies how pervasive racism is. So when we think that we know about racist act, especially in the video that we just saw, that's, you know, blatant police brutality, people just walking down the street, nothing on them, not even acting suspicious, and they get murdered, right? But our everyday experiences, those microaggressions of discrimination that are tearing down people of color, that are limiting productivity in our society, is because of this. So I'm going to go through these and give some relative examples if anyone's not familiar with how this manifests in our world, right? So spatial racism, not making a space for Black and Indigenous people in decision-making positions. And this is done intentionally, right, by the most well-meaning people. So we have people who like try to diversify their organization, but those key positions where changes are made, you will still see very intentionally people who are not marginalized. And people do that because psychologically, we like to work with people that we think we can identify with, people that we think that we can agree with, we can all understand each other and get things done. People don't necessarily like to engage conflict or even discussion, right? And so that spatial racism, that not purposely making a space. And we can make all kinds of excuses about qualifications and years of experience and things like that. But the reality is that we as people compartmentalize others. So spatial racism becomes a real problem because that's where changes are made. And we have to make space specifically for marginalized people. Environmental racism, when we talk about things like Native American reservations and pipelines and Flint, Michigan and the water crisis and redlining, we are talking about environmental racism. When people in power only allow habitation of land that has limited resources. When we're talking about how someone has the power to clean up an entire water supply for an entire county, but just doesn't. When you give the 1% of Native Americans still living on this land the most inhabitable, dry land to live on, that is environmental racism. And I'm sure people can think of other things as well, but this is what it is. And this is allowed, and it's legalized, and it exists. Internalized racism is that self-hate that grows from external societal messages. If you are a person of color and you have children, you would know that 80% of our job is telling our kids that they are better than what the world tells them they are. Going out and finding special books, special movies, to try to build the self-esteem in our kids. And it's, you know, when people have trainings, and you might have been at workshops where people point out these messages that are given, there's no denying it, right? That we are somehow conditioned and trained, because that's the society that we live in, to think that people with darker skin color are less than. And then when you live in that society and are expected to function in that society, expected to thrive in that society, it's an uphill battle, right? Colorism is a type of discrimination that occurs inside cultures of people of color, as well as outside. And again, not an American issue. Colorism exists all around the world. But it's really this belief that people with less melanin in their skin are somehow smarter or more capable. And again, it's a form of racism, right? We're looking at someone trying to determine their race, their culture, their background, just by the color of their skin. There have been some really institutionalized practices based on colorism. You know, when we're talking inside of people of color's community, there used to be certain fraternities and sororities, and certain clubs even, where you had to be lighter than a paper bag to join. This is called the paper bag test. It was a real thing, because that somehow, again, determined your worth, your value. Defensive othering is, again, a type of racism that is similar to internalized racism. But it's when a person of color does things or says things to confirm these negative stereotypes, these negative beliefs about their own race, to kind of differentiate themselves and make themselves safe around white people, right? We might call these things, these people, model minorities. I've heard people explained as them. When you really try to adapt and fit in with the culture, with the white culture, so that you become more acceptable, you become a safe person. And that happens almost instinctually. As another, we might have heard of code switching, where people of color go into these predominantly white spaces, which are most spaces, right, in our society. And we kind of adapt into the white culture, into the white belief system. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Interpersonal racism is really the most common racism, I guess, that people think about when they think about it. So we're talking about blatant discrimination and attacks on someone because of the color of their skin. Systemic racism and institutional racism, a lot of times I hear them used interchangeably, but they're really not. Because institutional racism are those written laws and policies, right? So like Jim Crow, redlining. But what happens is when those policies get taken off the books, they get deemed unconstitutional or unethical, but that mindset is still there, that practice, the ideology is still there. That is systemic racism. So when we look at pretty much any numbers of racial disproportionality in this country, we're looking at the amount of Black and Indigenous people who didn't graduate high school, or Black and Indigenous people who got expelled from school or are in prisons. And we look at rates like that, and we know that all of these other policies have been taken off the books, right? Supposedly. Unless you truly believe that Black people are inherently inferior to white people, then systemic racism is the only explanation for the problems that we see in our society with these numbers of disproportionality. Why are there so many brown people imprisoned? Is it because they're all just bad? Of course not. It's because of systemic racism. Public space racism is such a powerful thing right now because of social media. And I love social media, don't ever get me wrong. But what it does do is it gives everyone access to everything. When we saw what happened to Breonna Taylor, Black people now could feel as if they're not even safe in their own homes. Because we know what can happen to someone if just racially profiled sleeping in your bed. We weren't after Ahmaud Arbery. There was people who didn't feel safe jogging down the street. Not that they necessarily did before, but now that we are aware that you can be jogging down the street and someone could shoot you and record it and nothing could happen. Something eventually did happen, but essentially for a long period of our history, nothing happened. How does somebody feel safe? So public space racism is extremely detrimental to the mental health of Black and Indigenous people. Microaggressions are what I've heard described as death by 1,000 paper cuts, because they happen all the time, and most often they are denied or dismissed. They are these everyday verbal and nonverbal slights, snubs, or insults that communicate derogatory messages. What microaggressions do is they let that marginalized person know that this world, this society was not for them. It points out everything that is different about them and how it doesn't fit in. And so, especially when they're denied or dismissed, become even more harmful and detrimental to someone's mental health, to their productivity. So like we talked about, everybody in this society, right? All the people who make all the cultures that make up the society, it's almost as if we're living in these different dimensions. Like we're all living here and experiencing different lives. That's what it really feels like sometimes. So we're talking about our Black and Indigenous people who have this shared history of enslavement and genocide. We have other people of color here in this country who have varying access to the American dream, right? Really depending on, again, remember that the wheel? So really depending on the shade of their skin, their language, their religious practices, their abilities, really where they're from, their culture. And then there's the white people of this country, who many have determined now, and I believe that there are people who are overtly racist, people that are complicit, and then there are people who are anti-racist. And what does being anti-racist mean? It means that you are aware that people have different experiences in this country. We are so all not on the same playing field. And there is a history of white supremacy that is the soil of this country. So when people really think about how do we deal with this, and people always, I always feel like people really want like a blanket answer. Like, how do we fix this? How do we make this over? This is the reality. The reality is that fear and securing power and privilege, in other words, for some people, that's their safety, securing their safety, really has to do with how we view ourselves in this society. Historically, anthropologically, there are two different types of societies. There's these individualistic societies and these collective societies. There was a scale done in 2011 that kind of ranked each country based on, it was called the Individualistic Society Scale. And guess who was number one at 91%? America. 91% individualistic society. There was other countries that rated like an 11%. A 7%, I think, was the lowest. And when we look at the core, so we're looking at the core of like human nature, right? These societies, how we function, how we define success. It's by securing power or by securing our community. When individuals and their human nature and their true beliefs are about securing power, that is how white supremacy is born, and that is where racism comes from. When we start to realize that you cannot live on this earth by yourself, it would be really, really boring, I heard. And you understand how people need each other, and you have chosen collectivism. That is how community is born. That is how equality exists, and that stems equity. So when we're living in a society that breeds individualism and teaches us and all about individual success, it's really hard to grasp, number one, the real history, number two, the impact of that history, right? And even more importantly, what we can do about it. So what I would really like to do at this point is everyone to take 5 minutes, and we can stay in this large group, but we're going to take 5 minutes, and I want you to answer this question with this knowledge that you have absorbed for the past hour. and really think about, so you can write down, put it in your phone as a note, send an email to Stare, whatever you want to do. And what is your commitment or philosophy on anti-racism? So if you didn't have one before, you have 5 minutes now to think of one. Okay, so I'm really going to, so it's 10:10. We're going to come back at 10:15, and I'm not going to ask you to share. You don't have to, but if you want to write it in the chat, we might all really like to read that. So let's take 5 minutes. We're just going to take 1 more minute or a few more seconds. Thank you for sharing in the chat. And some people shared in the chat if anybody wants to go and read that. Some beautiful work going on. Yeah. And the reason that the word commitment is really important, because again, this is not always pleasant, right? So if you decide that the kind of person you want to be is that person that concentrates on your purpose here, your goals here, your desire here, right? And that desire is about other people, right? Then you make the commitment ahead of time, because it is not always pleasant and it's not always pretty, but it is always helpful. So the next part of this is a tool, and the tool is called Train. And what this tool does is it is a collection of ideas that are mental exercises that help train our perspectives to see problems associated with racism. Now, I want to preface this by saying, no, we cannot always live here. If you walk around looking for negativity, you will find it everywhere. So to go into these conversations the same way we went into this one, it is about going in with these thoughts of evolution, these thoughts of sharing light and love, and these thoughts of growing as people and society. So this is not a group of conversation starters to talk about how horrible life is. I mean, you can go there if you want to, but that is not the purpose of this at all. The purpose is to, just like you all were saying in the chat, to re-educate ourselves and to continue to grow our communities. Because I know I'm not white, but if I knew, I can only imagine that if I was living in a world that I was benefiting from because of hate and oppression, I would want to be aware of that. And so there's an acronym that we use. It's called TRAIN, and I'll go through each one of those. Now, at the end of this, everyone's going to have an opportunity. We're going to go into break. I'll let you know now. We're going to go into breakout groups. And the groups will be small, groups of 4. And everyone will have an opportunity to kind of begin these conversations. So we're going to pick one of the acronyms, one of the letters, and we're going to have, there's an activity associated with each one. And so in your breakout group, you will be able to just practice having these conversations. If you ever want to know what you as an individual person can do to help society, to help be anti-racist, the biggest thing you can do is say something when something happens. When there's conversations at the dinner table, when there's an opportunity to vote, of course we have to vote. That's the first and foremost thing you have to do. But we also need to educate other people. Even if you don't have all the tools and information, you now have enough background knowledge to say, I don't like that. That's not okay. Why are we thinking like that? Especially when things like microaggressions occur, sometimes we cannot pull up all the information for, if we're too emotional at the time, either way, because that definitely happens to me. You can't always pull up all this historical information to provide to someone, or even the correct terminology, but we can say, I don't like that. That kind of talk perpetuates racism. And on the side note, when things are calm, we have these conversations. So the T stands for track your thoughts. Research has now proven that having full conversations about implicit bias are not necessarily helpful, because they make people concentrate on how they got to where they are, when really the key is to just acknowledge that you're having implicit bias, you're having thoughts, and be aware of them. Postpone your responses until you can reframe them, and then reframe your thoughts to include an opposing perspective. Our brains do this. Our brains categorize things. It wants to make sure that we feel safe. That is what our brains do. Are we safe right now? So if implicit bias occurs, our brains, for whatever reason, is telling us that we are not safe because of all the other message that we got about Black or Indigenous people. And our brains tell us that we have to just pause it and reframe it, right? So a deeper dive into that would be acknowledging that you're having a biased thought, and actually I'm going to send this, it comes in like a little handbook that I made. So I'll send it to Robin so that everyone who's here today will get a copy of this handbook. So if I'm going too fast, you'll get to read it later. But the main purpose, of course, is the activities. So postpone your response until you can reframe it, right? So most people become defensive or agitated when they feel uncomfortable. That's what, again, human nature. Now, once you acknowledge that you're uncomfortable, okay, I'm uncomfortable right now, and then you pause, right, before you respond. This is a time to listen and observe to what other people are saying and what is going on around you, right? So understanding you're having a biased thought, pausing, and then when you do respond, make sure that you're not responding out of your implicit bias. You're responding because of the education that you have now been able to access. So once you assess your feelings in the situation, you can then determine if your uncomfortableness is something that can be dealt with. If you saw the situation or conversation from the point of view of someone who was oppressed. So here's an activity associated with that. And this is so interesting because, again, these initial conversations, most people, not even before they acknowledge the role that their race plays in a society, have even an uncomfortability identifying their own ethnicity, right? People like to say, and I've heard this many times, like, wouldn't it be nice if there was no color if we didn't see race? Yes, that would be swell. However, we are not there. We're just not there. So before we can get there, we have to acknowledge that it is here, right? So asking someone, what ethnicity do you identify with, is a really introspective opportunity. Then to further that, it's this, and I really love this question because you really get some very interesting answers. The question being to share about a time when you were the only person or one of a few people of your ethnicity in a space. What feelings did you notice and what happened? And I'm not going to give any examples for that because, again, so many different answers can come out, but it's really something to think about. So that is the T in train, is to track your own thoughts, and this activity really helps us do that. So again, if you want to take a picture of this activity, you can do that now. The R stands for realize your privilege. Now, initially I had in here realizing white privilege, right? And of course, the definition of being in there that not all white people have had to face hardships because of the color of their skin. But again, we're all in this together. And I have to acknowledge that I have certain privileges, right? Because I'd be walking around a hypocrite if I didn't. But then also, there's other people of color who have other privileges that Black people don't have, right? So part of this anti-racist work and understanding how hate and white supremacy work is about realizing our privileges, understanding the history of white supremacy throughout the world, but more specifically, even in your own society. Know that your voice and opinion are valuable. If you have a privilege, you have a closer seat at the table, right? May not be at the table, but encourage the active participation of Black and Indigenous voices. As many times as I have heard people talk about experiencing blatant acts of racism and blatant acts of discrimination and even microaggressions, the most damage occurs when those incidences are denied or dismissed. If you are in a position of privilege or power and a person of color is telling you about their experience, believe them. I cannot accentuate that enough. Believe them. So understanding the history of white supremacy. Again, we all know that we all have to do a re-education. There's a lot of things that we did not know about, didn't understand, that have a direct impact on our society. Enslavement, for a long time, they tried to talk about enslavement. First of all, it's not, the transatlantic slave movement was not about bringing slaves from Africa to America. It was about enslaving people. And people I often hear talk about there being slavery in history all around the world. But please understand that slavery and enslavement are two different people, two different things. Slaves was a class of citizen. People who were slaves were like the working class. It is very much a definition of the word. It's a class of people that were just, you were born into this class, into a society. It wasn't the best role, but the difference between a slave and an enslaved person is 4 things very specifically. Number 1, they were removed from their land of origin. People who were slaves were born, raised, worked, and lived pretty much in the same space. So enslaved people were removed from their land of origin. They were provided no compensation for their work. They were forbidden to practice their own culture, language, or traditions. And they were beaten to be coerced into work. So it's a lot different to enslave a person than it is to have been a slave historically. So understanding that is really important. Changing just that language. We're never going to talk about slaves again in reference to African American people. These people were enslaved persons. Understanding how redlining works, that there was actually laws that say that Black people can't live here. The way that over-policing works, incarceration, the way public education works, immigration policies, all of these things is really taking a deep dive into really understanding our real history. Know that your voices and opinion are valuable, and encourage the active participation of Black and Indigenous people. So the activity for this, there was this worksheet put together by a group called Transforming White Privilege, and they put together this white culture worksheet. And remember, we were talking about individualism versus collectivism. This really is 5 points talking specifically about how that manifests in our society. So the activity here is, so for example, the point number 3 being, white culture assigns a higher value to some ways of behaving than others. It often defines the other behaviors as dangerous and or deviant. When you really start to understand that, you start to look at people differently, right? The right to comfort people, what we consider even professional, what we consider to be polite societal behavior may be really white culture as opposed to a collectivism culture. So a question here that we can ask each other is really, in your organization, so your job, your school, your workplace, your home even, whatever, what behaviors are considered uncomfortable? What is okay, an okay way to handle conflict or loud voices or even sadness? And how does your organization or culture respond when these behaviors happen? Right? What lens are we really looking through? Another one, point number 5, is that white culture values certain ways of knowing and not others. Very specifically, if you can't measure it, it's not a value. Focus on cause and effect relationships and very linear thinking. So another question you could ask yourself is, in your organization, who or what informs you that a program or service is working? How is success defined? The A stands for analyze policies. And I know that that's, there's some pros in here about that. But really understanding that a lot of our policies were written to benefit wealthy and middle-class white people, from federal laws all the way down to our classroom rules, right? Policies often lack input from varying perspectives. Remember where we talked about spatial racism, right? And not having marginalized voices in these decision-making positions. So the key is continue. Do not be complacent with this. Learn about local and national policies. Talk about ramifications of these policies for people of color. And of course, take action. And then there's some further explanation about that. You will get that in the handbook. This is my ACLU is my jam. So I really like to say, if people have like no idea and they're really just starting to learn, I don't even have to tell you. People have already done this, right? Go to aclu.org. There's a tab that says Take Action. You click on that tab, and there are dozens of topics of things that are negatively affecting marginalized people in this country. So you can literally you have a group, you have a book club, you have a macrame club, whatever. Take turns discussing how these policies could be detrimental to marginalized people. The policies are there, become aware of them, and hear more information than you would expose yourself to with just your group. We have to be aware. The I stands for if that person was a different race. Comparing the scenarios based on similar past events, investigating the context of events from another perspective. It's sad because, I made this handbook not even a year ago, and these names are already probably could be replaced. But what you will see on here on the left is all people who are white, who committed acts of either murder or assault, and they are all living. On the right, you will see people who are Black, who were committed of petty crimes, accused, so to say committed, accused of petty crimes or nothing at all, and are dead. When we look at pretty much any existing story about large shootings, young white males in college committing crimes and being excused because they have such a bright future, is the thing that the judge said about Brock Turner. He has such a bright future. They don't want to imprison him. And he was pretty much caught in the middle act of assaulting a woman. And then we have people who were, of course, laying in their bed sleeping and had shot and murdered. So understand, again, part of policies and laws, being aware of what's happening. Don't be confused if Black and Indigenous people are upset about racism, right? Be aware. Ruth King, who wrote a book called Mindful of Race, and she's absolutely amazing, really described this as a heart disease. Racism is a heart disease, and how we think and respond to things that we hear in the news, right? How we think and respond to things that are happening around us is at the core of racial suffering and racial healing. And if we cannot think clearly and respond wisely, we will continue to damage the world's heart. An activity to expand upon this is the school to prison pipeline. This is a graphic from PBS. They did a whole series on the school to prison pipeline. And what's really interesting about the whole school to prison pipeline ideology, is that America is actually one of the nations that are initiating this type of study, or some organizations in America. So the activity for this would be to really look into the school to prison pipeline, to watch the series, specifically on PBS. They do a really great job with interviews and background information, and really just have a discussion about that. The N of my favorite stands for normalize other cultures. We couldn't have a greater opportunity to have a more beautiful, healing society than we have on this land, what the Native Americans called Turtle Island. We couldn't have a better opportunity. The culture of Black people in America is only 155 years old. Black people from America have their own traditions, beliefs, music, and values that are vastly different from that of the dominant culture. It's only 155 years old, and it was born from enslavement. So understanding that just because someone does things differently doesn't mean that it's worse. Because someone speaks a different language doesn't mean that it's worse. appreciating Black culture and its many strengths. One of the biggest things that I like to say in all of these workshops is to stop exoticizing other people's cultures. When we're talking about Thai food or Indian food, it is really just a food that other people just eat. There's nothing exotic about it. It's just food. When we talk about, we can appreciate the food and we can like the food, but when we exoticize something, can I touch your hair? I would like to wear a sari. Things like this, it again further marginalizes people. You don't belong in this society. This society is this culture, and you are so different and so exotic and so unique. So the end is to normalize that, right? We have to choose to really look at people differently. Christian Marco Piccolini is a self-proclaimed ex-white supremacist, and he goes around and he does speeches and works even individually with people who are suffering with this. And what he says is that he never met a white supremacist that didn't suffer from unresolved trauma. So we're talking really about a displaced hate. And when we hate people that are different from us, we are really hating some part of ourselves. That hate does not belong to those other people that are so exotic and different, right? And of course, appreciating other cultures. So an activity for this would be to either write down, and I always say to write down, I'll tell you why in a second, or take 2 minutes to write down 1 or 2 questions that you've always wanted to ask someone from a different ethnicity or cultural background. And this is really interesting because it helps us really kind of view how we think about other cultures. Are we exoticizing people? Or is it just food? Or is it just a hairstyle? It's just not that serious. These are other people just living their lives just like we live our lives. And the reason I say to write it down is because you always want to make, if you're asking someone or having this conversation, I'd always ask if someone is willing to share about their culture or ethnicity. Because if you just ask, people sometimes may get offended. So make sure you're in a space where you can actually have these conversations. So yeah, it's really interesting to notice how we may exoticize other cultures in our mind. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to, and I hope everybody, I'm actually going to go back to the tea. I feel like that may be the most surface one that we can do right now, but also thought-provoking. So we're going to go into these groups of 4, and we're going to answer these 2 questions. So we're going to take, if there's 4 in a group, let's do 10 minutes in the group, and everyone can go around and say, what ethnicity do you identify with? And share about a time when you were the only or one of few people of your ethnicity in a space, and what feelings did you notice and or what happened. And please know that these small groups are not recorded. And so feel free to, I know some people jumped out already. Feel free to share openly. They're not recorded, they're just with the people in the room, and there's only 4 people in the room. So we're going to go ahead and do that now, and then come back in 10 minutes. And we're not going to share out, but we are going to close up when we come back. Okay. Well, I hope everyone at least got a chance to share. My dog wants to share now, of course. But I hope everyone got a chance to share. And we just have a few minutes left. And so I do want to open up for any questions that anyone might have. I am going to leave, there's 2 reference pages up there. If anyone's really interested in jotting something down. But yes, so does anybody have any questions that I could attempt to answer in our few minutes that we have left together? I hope that I really do. My dog's name is Desi, and she is scratching at the door. She can't get in. Was that the question, the pressing question? But does anybody have any questions? Okay.
Oh,
so
Do we just unmute ourselves and ask the question?
Sure. Why don't we go ahead and move to gallery view, and that way everybody can see.
There we go.
All right, I'll jump in here because I did have a question and I put it in the chat here sort of, and it's that our group didn't get around to the second question. You had mentioned that that was a lot about how you even felt about, the question, because of course it's something that you're interested in. I couldn't really think of much. When I was thinking of it myself, I couldn't think of much. May I go ahead and share what I was going to say? Yeah,
absolutely.
Thanks. I was going to say the intrigue of African American women's hair. So there it is. I've exoticized it, right? I've otherized it. I've got this fine, crappy hair, So I always think that that's kind of curious. And I think, I don't know that I ever went around asking people if I could touch it though, but maybe I have been one of those, but I don't really remember that I have. So.
And you know what? That's interesting because in surface, it seems really innocent, right? Like if you were a white person in a country where the majority of people were Black, they would want to touch your hair, right? Because they've never seen hair like that before. The difference is that Black people are Americans and we've always been here, same time you've been here, right? So we shouldn't be that exotic. You know what I'm saying? So that's the difference. But I hear you. And yes.
But it's because we haven't been sharing,
Exactly.
Because you and I aren't going to the same stores just buy the same hair products, whatever, so we don't meet at the beauty parlor.
Exactly.
That brings up something to me. When I was in India, there aren't many blonde people in India, and the children, not just children, would gather around me, and they also knew I was a tourist because of that, and they wanted me to take pictures so that I could show them the screen with them on the picture screen. So that was interesting. I had never been noticed like that before.
Can I just jump in and sorry, I had to put myself on, leave the computer audio, so I don't know where the discussion is. I had to answer a phone call from my mom. Sorry. I wanted to sort of give another perspective on Stara's point, whenever that might be appropriate. Could I do that? Oh, I'm sorry. I get the otherizing part, and I certainly understand that. I also don't want, I'm concerned, I'm genuinely concerned though about people like myself. I'll put myself as a prime example, that are genuinely curious, that genuinely do want to find out, like, wow, your hair is really cool. What does it, I've never asked anyone to touch it or anything like that, but it has intrigued me. Wow, how do you wash it? How do you comb it out? Whatever. When I was a kid, of course, now I know differently, but I'm just saying we need to draw that fine line where we don't want to stifle kids' creativity and their curiosity. We want them to learn. We want them to understand. But how do we do that in a way that doesn't make people feel like they're being otherized, I guess?
I was saying
Can I say something as a Black woman in here, please? It depended, I think, in this country. I think it has been taboo. Okay. First of all, our hair was not accepted. However, with me, I had the experience of going to stay with a group in Switzerland. And they would just want to run and touch my hair or whatever. And it was okay. It was like, sure, and look them all, So it was a different culture. Here, Black women have been taught, that's their crown. And they have been ostracized. We've been ostracized because of our hair. So they've spent years trying to straighten it, using chemicals and what have you. And so they've been brought to be very sensitive. So Fatima, if you wanted to, touch my hair and you came to me on a one-to-one basis, you'd probably be accepted. But if you're in a whole group, depends on where you are, and say, "Oh, let me touch your hand," then you may get.
Yeah, that would be completely inappropriate. Yeah.
Remember when we talked about asking someone if they're open to have these conversations first? So if you go to someone one-on-one and be like, "Hey, you know what? I've never had a Black person over my house. I've never had a Black friend. I've never had a Black coworker that I've done more than a potluck with. And I really want to learn more about Black culture. Can we talk?" That's totally different. After 9/11, there was a nonprofit group formed called Meet a Muslim. And they literally would have Muslim people have these big feasts and invite people to come learn about us.
I'm one of them.
Yeah, I did that too.
So yes, that is the space, and bring the kids and whatever. And this is that is the space.
What you said just explains something that I've always wondered about. I teach in Kenya about, when it's not COVID, I teach some intensive courses once a year. And it's just very clear that we have different cultures. So the sharing is always out in the open, and and the give and take. And I've always wondered why I feel more comfortable in Kenya with Kenyans, even if I'm the only white person around, than I do in America with African Americans. It's because we're supposed to be sharing our culture when I'm in Kenya. We're supposed to be. It's the understood rule. And I would like to say about the hair that when my foster daughter from Kenya came to stay with me, I knew she was going to be here for long enough that she needed to have a haircut. So I asked around haircut where I go who could handle her hair, and it was an African American woman. And my daughter said she didn't understand about real African hair. She did it wrong. So there's a variety of hair, no matter what your ethnicity is.
Yes, and thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think, again, kind of reiterates what Yvonne was saying. You were not allowed to be a culture when you were enslaved and brought here, right? We didn't have a culture. You weren't allowed to speak your language. You weren't allowed to practice any cultural traditions, right? If so, it had to be in secret. Versus, in Kenya, the culture, there's a whole, history behind that too. But for the most part, there was just a different culture there. And so Georgia was visiting, right? Versus here, where we have to acculturate.
Yeah. The other thing I learned in Kenya, to my surprise, is that colonization was received differently by the Quakers. I'm a Quaker in Western Kenya. The British are viewed as oppressors, but the white Quakers are viewed as the people who brought schools and hospitals and churches. That kind of surprised me. That was the colonization was something that I really kind of felt that I needed to tiptoe around or figure out. And when I found out it wasn't an issue with my students, I was quite amazed, actually.
There's a lot to say about that. There are people, I'm very familiar with Ghana, for example, and the Ghanaian generation that came right before mine, so that would be, our parents and grandparents, always wish that there was still British rule in Ghana, because there was so much more peace and organization back then, right? But if you look historically at what colonization has done to the economy of every economy in this land, in this world, you would realize that there has been more harm, incredible harm, that has been done. right? So in lack of other words, exactly what happened here to Black people in this country who were brought up thinking that George Washington never told a lie, and this is land is your land and land is my land. It never really was, right? It never was meant to be. But even, yeah, it still isn't. And just like the lands over in Africa that were divided by who colonized them, they don't know any better right now because they were taught just like we were taught. You are a Kenyan and this is the language spoken in Kenyan. Yes, there are still people there who are very knowledgeable of the history of the land, but it doesn't benefit them to know the history because it's just sad and depressing and demoralizing. So they work with what they have. But that was a lot, but yes.
Well, the tribe that is predominantly Quaker, there's a arbitrary border down the middle that separates the Luyas in Kenya from the Luyas in Uganda. And yet they are the same tribe. And then the Christian missionary movement just, made that even worse, exacerbated it, because you're Presbyterian. Oh, okay, you can go over to the Kikuyu. You're Episcopalian. You get the Kalenjins, Roman Catholic. No, you get the Luos. So it's just, another separation to a people that need to come together to have their power.
So you're ahead of the game, Georgia, even having the knowledge of this existing. Most people have no idea that those maps that separate countries on that continent of Africa are not real. Those are drawn up from people who came and murdered and pillaged the land and said, okay, you can have this part Belgium and you can have this part France and you can have this part Italy and you can have this part. I mean, it's horrendous.
It is.
Yeah.
And yet I know enough to feel like a bull in a china closet sometimes.
Yeah.
We have enough time for one or two more questions.
This has been enormously interesting and comprehensive and helpful. And I'm like, wow, this is just so much incredible information in the span of hours. I mean, this is something that really should be a college course. I mean, it could, to the extent that you want to go into that level of depth about it. But I just wanted to say thank you. And I really liked it. And I may have to dash in a minute to take care of
Monica. Dennis.
Yeah, this was just so great. I'm just sorry there were so few people here. I hope we'll all share the video with people that we know. And
I'm also thinking about how about some homework, Monica? You gave us a little bit of homework. Okay, I got something to talk to Catherine and Robin about, how we're dealing with conflict and other such. I think that for me, I feel like one of the big things is the tracking. Just track it, maybe even write it down, right? Is that the idea? Like write it down when you have that, because it pops up a lot. And, the other thing is just like, how about when you hear people say something that, shouldn't be said aloud, it shouldn't be said aloud. And it's like, oh, well, it's just in front of you. And it's like, no, it's not just in front of me. It's let's track this. Why are you having these thoughts if you're supposed to be on, team unity? So, okay. Thank you so much, Monica. And thank you everybody for coming. And I don't think that this was such a bad showing with 34, almost 40 people here, a workshop, and we've got some tools to use, and we can go away with it. Now let Monica say the last word.
But I just want to say that everybody, we will be doing a recap that will have the videos and the handbook in it. So look for that. It will go to everyone who's registered for the Women's Summit. But if you share it with your friends, that's okay.
Well, also the train stop,
right. All of that will go.
Yeah.
But it will go to all the Women's Summit attendees.
I joined at the last minute and it had me go directly to here, so I'm not sure my name is officially registered.
Oh, it is. Don't worry.
Okay, thanks.
It's okay. We got you down, Patricia.
Okay, good. Really want the handbook.
Well, I just want to say thank you for being here again. I know this is not pleasant, but it's necessary. And so I really do appreciate people listening and having conversation. Is so important. Don't ever stop talking. And if you even don't know what to say, just say that's not okay. It can just stop. That's not okay.
Monica, how can we continue the conversation with you offline if we'd like to? If we'd like to get in touch with you for maybe have you as a speaker or just, talk to you about a question that we might have.
Yeah, you can go to resetnow.org. It's reset with the C, RECET now.org. And all of my contact information is there, along with, if you go under services, you will see once a week or so, we do online workshops about the impact of racial trauma. We have a whole workshop on racial microaggressions. And of course, my email is on there too, if you want to ask questions.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Monica. And we'll see you this week. We have a lot of wonderful workshops going on every night this week. And of course, Harrisonburg is this coming weekend.